The victims had nothing in common. That was the pattern. A 6-year-old child, an 82-year-old woman, men, women, entire couples. Some were shot, some were stabbed, some were beaten with whatever the intruder found inside the house. The attacks happened in wealthy suburbs and working-class neighborhoods, miles apart, with no consistent weapon, no consistent victim type, no consistent method of entry beyond one detail: an unlocked window, an open door. The heat of a California summer. For decades, homicide investigators had relied on a simple truth: serial killers follow rules. Their own rules, but rules. They select a type. They repeat a method. They hunt inside a territory. Those patterns are the thread investigators pull until the case unravels. In the summer of 1985, Los Angeles faced something the most experienced detectives in the county said they had never seen before: a predator with no type, no method, and no territory. A killer whose only signature was that he refused to have one. This is the story of how one man held the second-largest city in America hostage for 14 months. How a young detective saw a connection no one else believed. How the most advanced forensic technology of its era came down to a single fingerprint. And how, in the end, the killer was not stopped by the police, by the FBI, or by the largest manhunt in California history, but by ordinary residents of an East Los Angeles neighborhood on a Saturday morning with their bare hands. To understand how that summer became possible, the file does not open in Los Angeles. It opens 40 years earlier, 700 miles away, in a border city in West Texas. Ricardo Leiva Muñoz Ramirez was born on February 29, 1960, in El Paso, Texas, the youngest of 5 children. His parents, Julian and Mercedes, were Mexican immigrants who had crossed into Texas, looking for the kind of stability that post-war America promised working families. Julian had been a policeman in Juarez before becoming a laborer on the Santa Fe Railroad. He was, by every account that survives, a hard worker and a man with a violent temper. When rage overtook him, he did not always direct it at his children. Neighbors and family members later described episodes in which Julian, frustrated beyond control, struck himself with tools, beating his own head with a hammer until the anger burned out. The children learned early that violence in that house was not an event. It was weather. Mercedes worked at a boot factory while pregnant with Richard, mixing chemical compounds in a poorly ventilated room. She was eventually transferred after complaining of fumes, but researchers who later reconstructed the family history flagged that exposure as the first entry in a long medical ledger. The Ramirez children were born into a body count of environmental and physical damage before any of them made a single choice of their own. Richard's older brothers struggled with bone deformities and behavioral problems, and Richard himself would accumulate, before the age of 6, 2 significant head injuries, the kind of injuries that forensic psychologists would spend the next 4 decades pointing to. The first came at age 2. A dresser toppled onto him, opening a gash across his forehead that required roughly 30 stitches. The second came at age 5, when a swing struck him in the head at a playground and knocked him unconscious. Shortly afterward, the seizures began. Richard was diagnosed with epilepsy in childhood, episodes that would seize him without warning into his early teens, sometimes freezing him mid-motion in the classroom. The seizures eventually faded. What they left behind is a question that neurologists and criminal psychologists still debate. Damage to the frontal and temporal regions of a developing brain, the regions governing impulse control, aggression, and empathy, appears again and again in the case files of violent offenders. It is never an explanation on its own. Millions of people live with childhood head trauma and epilepsy and harm no one. But in the forensic reconstruction of Richard Ramirez, it is the first of a series of factors that stack one on top of another with almost mechanical precision. The second factor had a name: Miguel. Miguel Ramirez was Richard's older cousin, a decorated Green Beret who returned to El Paso from Vietnam in the early 1970s. To a 12-year-old boy with a violent father and a failing school record, Mike was magnetic. He had survived a war. He had stories. And he had Polaroids. The photographs Miguel showed his young cousin were not war souvenirs in any conventional sense. They were trophies, images, documenting atrocities Miguel claimed to have committed against Vietnamese women: rape, torture, murder. He narrated them to Richard the way other veterans showed pictures of their unit, and he attached a lesson to them, one that investigators and psychiatrists would later identify as foundational: that a man could do these things and come home, that there could be power without consequence. The two spent long afternoons together, smoking marijuana. Richard had started using the drug around age 10, while Miguel taught him what he had learned about killing: how to move silently, how to strike with certainty, how to feel nothing. Then came May 4th, 1973. Richard, 13 years old, was in his cousin's apartment when Miguel and his wife Jessie began to argue. She had been pressing him to find work. In the middle of the argument, Miguel produced a revolver and shot her in the face. She died in front of the boy. Blood spattered across the room. Some accounts place it on Richard himself. He stood there, feet away, watching the lesson from the Polaroids happen in 3 dimensions. What happened next matters as much as the murder itself. Miguel Ramirez was arrested, tried, and found not guilty by reason of insanity, his defense anchored in post-traumatic stress from Vietnam. He was committed to a state hospital and released after approximately 4 years. 4 years. The boy who had watched Jessie die absorbed the arithmetic. His cousin had killed a woman in front of a witness, and the system had returned him to the street before Richard finished being a teenager. If the Polaroids taught that violence could go unpunished in a war zone, the verdict taught that it could go nearly unpunished at home. The family later marked that day as the visible fracture point. Richard, already quiet, went silent. He began sleeping in the local cemetery. He said it was the only place he could find peace. He moved out of his parents' house and in with his older sister Ruth and her husband Roberto, a decision that, in a family history crowded with bad luck, ranks among the worst. Roberto was a compulsive voyeur. At night, he prowled the neighborhood, peering into windows, and he began taking his teenage brother-in-law along. Where Miguel had taught the boy that violence carried no price, Roberto taught him something subtler and, in the reconstruction of what came later, just as important: the specific psychology of the window. The thrill of watching people inside their homes, people who believed themselves safe while standing unseen in the dark. Every crime Richard Ramirez would later commit began exactly there, at the boundary between the darkness outside a house and the life inside it. The rest of his adolescence reads like a countdown. He drifted away from Jefferson High School and dropped out in the 9th grade. His drug use escalated from marijuana to glue sniffing and LSD, long dissociative binges that he later described as opening doors in his mind. It was in this period that his fascination with Satanism took root, fed by heavy metal records and a copy of Anton LaVey's Satanic Bible. Psychiatrists who examined him years later were careful on this point, and this file will be careful too. There is no evidence that any belief system made Richard Ramirez kill. What the satanic framework gave him was a costume for impulses that already existed, a mythology in which cruelty was not a defect, but a philosophy, in which he was not a damaged boy from El Paso, but a servant of something vast. It let him narrate himself as chosen rather than broken. At 15, he took a job at a Holiday Inn near the border, and the job became a hunting method. Using a stolen passkey, he entered guests' rooms and robbed them while they slept, his first systematic practice at the skill that would define him, moving through occupied rooms without waking anyone. It ended the night he entered a room where a woman was alone and attempted to rape her. Her husband returned and beat the teenager into the ground until police arrived. Richard was arrested, and then the pattern from Miguel's trial repeated itself in miniature. The couple lived out of state, declined to return to Texas to testify, and the charges collapsed. He walked away with a juvenile record and one more data point confirming the lesson. Consequences were optional. By his late teens, El Paso had nothing left to teach him. 2 arrests for marijuana possession, a conviction for theft, a reputation, and a family that had stopped pretending they could reach him. Around 1978, Richard Ramirez boarded a bus for California. He drifted first through San Francisco, then settled into the orbit of downtown Los Angeles, the Skid Row hotels, the Greyhound station lockers where he stored his belongings, the all-night bus rides where he slept sitting up. He replaced LSD with cocaine, and the cocaine ran his schedule, awake for days, moving at night, financing the habit the only way he knew, burglary. And here the file records something investigators would later acknowledge with professional discomfort. He was good at it. Years of practice, the hotel rooms, the voyeur patrols with Roberto, the survival economy of the streets had produced a burglar of genuine skill. He entered homes through unlocked windows and pet doors, moved through bedrooms while owners slept an arm's length away, and left with jewelry and cash that he converted into drugs and bus fare. Los Angeles in the early 1980s logged tens of thousands of burglaries a year. His were drops in an ocean. No one was looking for him because he had not yet given anyone a reason to look. That changed on a June night in 1984 in the Glassell Park district of Los Angeles at the apartment of a 79-year-old woman named Jenny Vincow, the first murder on Californian soil that investigators would definitively attach to his name, and the point where this case stops being a biography and becomes a body count. Her window had been left open against the heat. The intruder entered intending to rob. What he did instead announced to anyone who could have read the scene that Los Angeles now had a new kind of predator, one whose violence exceeded any burglar's logic and whose appetite had crossed a line it would never cross back. And in a detail that would take 25 years and a DNA database to surface, Jenny Vincow was not the first. Months earlier, in April 1984, in the basement of a San Francisco residential hotel, a 9-year-old girl named Mei Leung had been murdered. The case went unsolved for a quarter-century, until 2009, when forensic analysts matched DNA from the scene to Richard Ramirez. The youngest documented victim in the file predates the file itself. When the Los Angeles spree finally began, the man behind it had already been killing longer than anyone knew. June 28, 1984. Glassell Park, northeast Los Angeles. The temperature had held in the 80s all week, and in the modest apartment buildings along the hillside streets, air conditioning was a luxury most tenants did not have. Jenny Vinco, 79 years old, lived alone in a ground-floor apartment. Her son lived directly above her. That night, like most nights that summer, she left her window open. Her son found her the following afternoon. She was on her bed, and the scene exceeded anything the responding officers had encountered in careers spent in one of America's most violent cities. Jenny Vinco had been stabbed repeatedly. The wounds concentrated with a fury that had no relationship to robbery, and her throat had been cut so deeply that the coroner would note she was nearly decapitated. The apartment had been ransacked, but the take was almost nothing. She was a poor woman with little to steal, and the medical examination confirmed a detail that separated this crime from the city's ordinary homicide traffic. The killer had sexually assaulted her body after death. Consider what that scene actually says. Read forensically. A burglar kills when cornered. A shout, a struggle, a panicked strike, flight. That is the grammar of a burglary gone wrong, and detectives read it fluently. Nothing in Jenny Vinco's apartment followed that grammar. The violence continued long past her death. The assault occurred after it. Whoever came through that window had entered as a thief, discovered something about himself in that room, and stayed to explore it. Investigators recovered fingerprints from the window screen. Clean, usable prints. But in 1984, a fingerprint without a suspect was a question without an answer. California's automated fingerprint database did not yet exist in operational form. The prints went into a file. The file went into a drawer. And the case went cold in a city that recorded well over 700 murders that year. Then, nothing. For 8 months, the man who killed Jenny Vinco appears nowhere in the homicide record. The file offers 2 readings of that silence, and honest analysis holds both. The first is that he simply continued burglarizing, hundreds of entries, none escalating, the compulsion satisfied by proximity alone. The second, supported by his own later statements and by cases never conclusively resolved, is that the silence is an illusion of the record, that there were other crimes in those months that were never connected. What the record does establish is that when he resurfaced, the hesitation was gone. The man who came back in March 1985 was no longer a burglar who had killed. He was a killer who used burglary as his method of entry. March 17th, 1985. Rosemead, San Gabriel Valley. Just before midnight, a 34-year-old traffic manager named Dale Okazaki and her roommate Maria Hernandez returned to the condominium they shared. Hernandez pulled into the garage, stepped out of the car, and heard something behind her. She turned into the barrel of a pistol held by a tall, thin man dressed in dark clothing. He fired at her head from close range. The bullet should have killed her. It did not, because of the car keys in her raised hand. The round deflected off the metal, and Hernandez dropped to the garage floor, understanding instantly that her survival depended on being dead. The gunman stepped over her and went inside. In the kitchen, Dale Okazaki heard the noise and ducked behind the counter. When she raised her head to look, he shot her once in the forehead. She died where she fell. He walked out through the garage, past Hernandez, who had gotten up and who now faced him a second time. She begged, And here, the file records one of the case's genuinely inexplicable moments. He lowered the gun and ran. The woman he had shot at point-blank range minutes earlier was allowed to live. Investigators would find no logic in it then and none since. His mercy, like his violence, followed no rule, and that absence of rule would soon become the defining feature of the entire investigation. He was not finished that night. Within the hour, in nearby Monterey Park, a 30-year-old law clerk named Tsai Lian Yu, Veronica to her friends, was driving home when a car began pacing hers. The man forced her off the road, dragged her from the driver's seat of her yellow Chevrolet, and when she fought him, shot her twice and left her dying beside her own car as a passing motorist stopped, too late to help. She died at the hospital. 2 attacks, 2 jurisdictions, 1 hour apart. A woman shot in her garage in Rosemead. A woman pulled from her car in Monterey Park. Different circumstances, different police agencies, no obvious connection, except to one investigator who did not yet know either case would belong to him. Gil Carrillo was 34 years old, a homicide detective with the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, young for the unit, a Vietnam veteran raised in the same East LA neighborhoods he now worked. When the Okazaki and Yu killings crossed his desk alongside other recent attacks, Carrillo began entertaining an idea that violated the operating doctrine of his profession, that crimes with different victims, different weapons, and different methods might be the work of a single man. The doctrine said otherwise. Serial offenders kept to a type, that consistency was the entire basis of linkage analysis. When Carrillo brought his theory forward, the reaction from veteran investigators ranged from skepticism to open dismissal. One man attacking women, couples, the elderly, and children with guns and knives across multiple cities. It was unheard of. The most experienced detectives in the county said exactly that. A criminal with such wide-ranging victims and such varied methods of killing was outside anything on record. 10 days later, the killer made his case for him. March 27, 1985. Whittier. Vincent Zazzara, 64, a retired investment counselor who had recently opened a pizzeria, fell asleep on the couch in front of the television. His wife, Maxine, 44, a lawyer, was in the bedroom. The intruder entered through a window and shot Vincent in the head, where he slept. He never woke. Then the killer went to the bedroom, where Maxine was awake. He demanded her valuables, bound her hands, and began ransacking the room. And Maxine Zazzara, in an act investigators would recount with unconcealed respect, got free, reached under the bed for the shotgun her husband kept there, leveled it at the intruder, and pulled the trigger. The gun was unloaded. What he did to her in the minutes that followed, this file will not render in detail. The coroner's report exists, the trial record exists, and their contents justified every hour of the manhunt that followed. It is enough to record that he shot her, mutilated her body afterward, and took her eyes with him when he left. Not as an accident of frenzy, deliberately. The act was so far beyond the vocabulary of ordinary homicide that it functioned in effect as a confession of what he was. The scene at Jenny Vincho's apartment had not been an aberration. It had been an introduction. But the Zazzara scene contained something else, something the killer did not know he had left. In the flower bed beneath the entry window, pressed into soil the family had recently watered, were shoe prints. Clear, detailed, measurable, an Avia athletic shoe, size 11.5. When investigators traced the model, the trail produced one of those statistics that decide cases. The shipment of that specific model and size to the western United States had been minuscule, and the evidence pointed to a single pair having reached the Los Angeles market. Somewhere in a metropolitan area of 8 million people, one man was walking through crime scenes in the only pair of those shoes in the city. From that night forward, the print became the investigation's connective tissue. It would surface again and again, in gardens, on windowsills, and before the summer ended, in a location so obscene it hardened every investigator who saw the photograph. Carrillo took the accumulating file to the one man in the department whose endorsement could override the skeptics: Frank Salerno. Salerno was a legend in California homicide work, the lead investigator who had broken the Hillside Strangler case 7 years earlier, a methodical, taciturn detective whose word carried the weight of that history. Salerno reviewed the linkages, the shoe print recurring across scenes, the ballistic threads, the nocturnal entries through unlocked windows and doors, the geography radiating through the San Gabriel Valley. And the legend reached the same conclusion as the rookie. Different victims, different weapons, one man. The two were partnered at the head of what would grow into the largest task force Los Angeles County had assembled since, fittingly, the Hillside Stranglers. They understood the mechanism they were up against even then. Strip away the apparent randomness, and a structure emerged, not of victim selection, but of procedure. He hunted between midnight and dawn. He chose single-story homes near freeway access, in quiet residential neighborhoods, favoring houses in shades he could dissolve against. He entered through what residents left open against the heat. Males died first, and immediately. A shot to the head while sleeping, the threat eliminated before it could wake. Then he had time. That was the horror of the method when investigators finally articulated it. The randomness was not chaos. It was camouflage. He had removed every variable the police used to predict killers, type, method, territory, and kept only the ones that made killing efficient. Carrillo would later describe the realization in plain terms. There was no way to warn the public about who was at risk, because the answer was everyone. The spring bore that out with a cruelty that reads, in the case chronology, like escalation on a schedule. May 14th, Monterey Park. William Doy, 66, shot in the head when he rose from bed at a sound in the house. His wife, Lillian, disabled by a stroke, was bound and assaulted. William Doy's last act was reaching the telephone that summoned help. He died at the hospital, and the file credits that call with saving his wife's life. May 29th, Monrovia. Mabel Bell, 83, and her sister Florence Lang, 81, two women living quietly in a small house, beaten with a hammer taken from their own kitchen. On the walls and on the bodies, drawn in lipstick belonging to the victims, investigators found pentagrams. Florence survived. Mabel died of her injuries weeks later, never having regained consciousness. The following day, in Arcadia, Mary Louise Cannon, 75, was found stabbed to death in her ransacked home. Pause on the Monrovia scene, because it marks a shift the task force noted with alarm. The pentagrams were new, not as belief, but as communication. Through the spring, the killer had left scenes that spoke only through violence. Now he was signing them. Symbols on walls. Later symbols demanded of victims themselves. Survivors would describe being forced to declare allegiance to Satan while he worked. The forensic reading of that behavior is colder than the tabloid reading. It was theater, staged by a man who had begun to follow his own press coverage and understood he was becoming a character. The city did not yet have a name for him. The newspapers were testing several, but he had already grasped the thing that separates a killer from a legend, and he wanted the promotion. June 2nd, Sierra Madre. Whitney Bennett, 16 years old, asleep in her bedroom, was beaten with a tire iron and strangled with a telephone cord. She survived, one of the rare failures of his method, and the file preserves the detail that he interpreted her survival through his own mythology, later claiming the cord had sparked in his hands as proof of divine interference. The forensic explanation is simpler. He was rushed and she was young and strong. But the case gave the task force a living witness and gave the city's parents a new dimension of fear. The victims now ranged from teenagers to women in their 80s. 29 days remained in June. He was accelerating, and Los Angeles, which did not yet know his face, his name, or his pattern, because there was no pattern, was about to learn what a city sounds like when 8 million people stop sleeping. The victims now ranged from women in their 60s to women in their 80s, from sleeping husbands to disabled wives. And Los Angeles, which did not yet know his face, his name, or his pattern, because there was no pattern, was about to enter the worst summer in its criminal history. May 30th, 1985. Burbank. Carol Kyle, 41, woke before dawn to a flashlight in her eyes and a gun at her head. Her 11-year-old son was in the next room. The intruder handcuffed the boy, locked him in a closet, and assaulted his mother. And then, in another of the case's unexplained inversions, spared them both. Before leaving with her jewelry, he told her something survivors would report in nearly identical words all summer, that she should not scream, that she should be quiet, and that if she cooperated, he would not kill her. Sometimes it was true, sometimes it was not. The task force could find no variable that predicted which. That was the intelligence problem in its purest form. The killer's own decisions appeared to be made in the moment, inside the houses, by criteria no analyst could model. You cannot forecast a man who does not forecast himself. June 27th, Arcadia. Patty Elaine Higgins, 32, a piano teacher, was found in her home with her throat cut. 5 days later, July 2nd, the same city, Mary Louise Cannon, 75, was found stabbed to death in a ransacked bedroom, an avia shoe print pressed into the carpet's pile. The task force now watched the intervals between attacks collapse, months between the first killings, then weeks, now days. In the forensic literature, that compression has a name, devolution, and it usually signals a killer whose fantasy no longer survives contact with reality, who needs more, sooner, to reach the same place. Devolving killers make mistakes. But devolving killers also produce bodies at a rate that turns an investigation into triage. July 5th. Sierra Madre. Whitney Bennett, 16 years old, asleep in her bedroom, was beaten with a tire iron and strangled with a telephone cord. She survived. She would need nearly 500 stitches, and her survival gave the file one of its strangest entries. The killer later claimed that as he strangled her, the cord sparked in his hands, and that he fled believing a force was protecting the girl. The forensic reading is unsentimental. He was interrupted mid-method, in a hurry, and 16-year-olds fight. But the claim mattered to investigators for a different reason. It confirmed that the man they were hunting had fully entered his own mythology. He was no longer a burglar with a costume. He believed the costume. July 7th. Monterey Park. The third attack in that small city, a geographic repetition that broke his own anti-pattern and told the task force he had comfort zones after all. Joyce Lucille Nelson, 61, was beaten to death in her living room. On her body, a sole print matched the avia. That same night, blocks away, he forced his way into the home of Sophie Dickman, 63, a psychiatric nurse. He handcuffed her, demanded her valuables, attempted to rape her, and, furious that her rings would not come off, made her swear on Satan that she had no more jewelry. She survived. 2 women, 1 night, 1 city, 1 dead, 1 living. The morning briefing wrote itself into a single unbearable sentence. He can do this every night, anywhere, to anyone, and we do not know his face. 2 weeks of silence. Then July 20th, the night that removed any remaining ceiling on what a single offender could do between sunset and sunrise. In Glendale, Maxon Niding and his wife Layla, both 66, were shot to death in their bed. The scene bore mutilation the coroner logged, and this file will not. Hours later, 14 miles away in Sun Valley, he entered the home of the Covenant family. Chainarong Covenant, 32, was shot in the head as he slept. His wife, Somkid, was raped and beaten and forced, like Sophie Dickman, to swear to Satan. Their 8-year-old son was bound. She survived. She would later testify with a composure that silenced the courtroom. 4 victims, 2 families, 2 cities, 1 night. The ballistic comparisons tied the scenes together, and the task force released the conclusion it had been holding. The crimes were connected, and the connection was one man. The city needed a name for him, and the press supplied several before one held. The walk-in killer, the Valley Intruder, then borrowed from headlines and destined to outlive everyone in the story, the Night Stalker. Read the name forensically, and you understand why it won. It did not describe a victim type, because there was none. It did not describe a method, because there was none. It described the only 2 facts the public had. He came at night, and he was hunting. The name told 8 million people the truth the task force had been living with since March. The profile of the potential victim was the census. What Los Angeles did next is documented in commerce as much as in crime reports. And it belongs in this file because it measures the psychological event. Gun stores sold out of handguns and shotguns and reported waiting lists. Locksmiths worked weekends installing deadbolts and window bars in neighborhoods that had never used them. Hardware stores sold out of window locks. Sporting goods stores ran short of ammunition. Attendance at self-defense classes multiplied. And across the San Gabriel Valley, in the middle of one of the hottest summers of the decade, families sealed their windows at night and slept in the heat. Because the one behavioral fact everyone had absorbed was that he came in through what was left open. Emergency dispatchers logged surges of prowler calls every night. Neighbors organized patrols. People slept with lights on, in shifts, weapons within reach. An American metropolis was, in functional terms, under siege by one man. And the siege was working precisely because he had no pattern to hide from. You could not tell yourself, I am not his type. Everyone was his type. Inside the task force, the pressure had a different texture. Carrillo and Salerno now commanded an operation that would grow into hundreds of officers across multiple agencies. Los Angeles County Sheriff, LAPD, and the police departments of the smaller cities he had struck, processing thousands of tips, each one requiring hours to run down, almost all of them worthless. The two detectives worked days that ended past midnight and began again before dawn. Carrillo, whose theory had built the case, moved his own family out of their home to a relative's house, a detail worth holding for a moment, because it is the purest measure of the summer that exists. The homicide detective, leading the manhunt, looked at what he knew about the killer, looked at his own house in the suburbs, and concluded that his family was not safe in it. The man hunting the Night Stalker was also hiding from him. They had evidence, more than the public knew. The avia print, recurring scene to scene like a signature the killer did not know he was writing. Ballistics linking multiple shootings to the same small-caliber weapons. Survivor descriptions converging on a consistent physical portrait. Male, Hispanic, tall and thin, long dark curly hair, dark clothing, bad teeth. That last detail repeated by witnesses with a specificity that would eventually matter enormously. Stolen property was surfacing in the pawn shops and street markets of downtown LA, sketching his financial geography. And investigators quietly staked out places his behavior predicted. Fence networks, dental clinics, because a man whose teeth every witness remembered would eventually need a dentist. They came agonizingly close on exactly that vector. Records at a downtown clinic produced a name and a near miss that would torment the unit. He was moving through the city's transient infrastructure, buses, flop houses, the Greyhound station, a hunting method that doubled as concealment. The task force was reconstructing him from fragments. What they did not have was the fragment that mattered, a name and a face to attach the file to, and the killer, reading his own coverage, he followed the papers, survivors and later statements confirm it, responded to the manhunt not by stopping, but by expanding the map. August 6, Northridge. Christopher Peterson, 38, and his wife, Virginia, 27, were both shot in their bedroom, and both survived Christopher despite a bullet in the head. He fought his attacker, who fled. August 8th, Diamond Bar, Ahmed Zia, 35, shot and killed as he slept. His wife, Sue Key, assaulted and forced through the ritual oath. The ballistics matched. The geography now spanned the entire basin, from the west San Fernando Valley to the eastern county line, a hunting range so large that no neighborhood could tell itself it was outside it. Then the attacks in Los Angeles stopped. For the task force, silence from this killer was not relief. It was a variable moving out of view. He had not stopped in the winter of 1984, and he had not stopped now. He had done something simpler and worse. He had gotten on a bus. 560 kilometers north, San Francisco's residents were following the Night Stalker story the way the rest of the country was, as news from somewhere else. On the night of August 17th, in the quiet Lake Merced district, that distance evaporated, and the 2 rounds fired inside a house on that street were about to do something the killer did not intend: connect his file, in one stroke, to a politician's microphone, a furious mayor, and the mistake that begins the countdown to his face on every front page in America. August 17th, 1985, Lake Merced District, San Francisco. Peter Pan, 66, an accountant, and his wife, Barbara, 64, were asleep in their home when the intruder came through an unsecured entry sometime after midnight. Peter was shot in the head and died where he lay. Barbara was beaten and shot. She survived, with injuries that would mark the rest of her life. On the bedroom wall, drawn in lipstick, investigators found a pentagram and a scrawled invocation of Satan. The scene was, in every forensic particular, a Los Angeles scene. The sleeping husband eliminated first, the wife brutalized, the staging, the small-caliber ballistics. San Francisco homicide detectives contacted Los Angeles within hours. The comparison work confirmed what the Wall had already announced. The Night Stalker's hunting range was no longer a metropolitan area. It was the state of California. The strategic implication deserves a moment because it explains the fury of what happened next. A killer with no victim type and no fixed method had been contained, at least conceptually, by geography. The task force could concentrate resources where he hunted. The San Francisco attack deleted that containment. Every city on a bus line was now inside the perimeter. And a manhunt that had been the operational property of homicide detectives became, overnight, the political property of elected officials facing terrified constituents, which produced the most consequential press conference of the case. In the days after the Pan attack, San Francisco's mayor, Dianne Feinstein, stood before cameras and, intending to reassure the public that investigators were closing in, disclosed specifics of the evidence linking the crimes. Among the details that reached the airwaves were the very threads the task force had spent 5 months protecting: the ballistic linkage between scenes and the shoe print evidence, the avia, the single pair in the Los Angeles market, the signature he did not know he was writing. Carrillo and Salerno watched the broadcast with a reaction they later described in language ranging from despair to unprintable. The entire architecture of the case rested on the killer not knowing which of his habits identified him. Now the habits had been read to him on television. He was watching. He confirmed it later, and his behavior confirmed it immediately. The .25 caliber pistol tied to multiple scenes vanished from the record, and the avia shoes, by his own subsequent account, went off the Golden Gate Bridge into the bay. The one physical thread that had followed him from the Zazara flower bed through a summer of scenes was cut in a single news cycle. In the annals of American manhunts, the episode became a permanent case study in the cost of political communication colliding with evidentiary discipline. The file records it without editorializing. The task force lost its signature, and the killer, informed of exactly what the state knew, adjusted and kept hunting. But the disclosure had a second-order effect that the killer, adjusting his equipment, did not weigh. It told him the net was tightening, and a tightening net changes a predator's geography. Los Angeles was saturated. Task force patrols, armed homeowners, neighborhoods that had turned themselves into tripwires. San Francisco was now awake, so for his next attack he selected territory that had followed the story only as news from up the freeway, far enough south to feel outside the perimeter. Orange County. Mission Viejo. A master-planned suburb of curving streets and two-car garages, statistically among the safest communities in California. The kind of place the siege had not reached. August 25th, 1985. Around 2 a.m, he entered the home of Bill Carnes, 29, a computer engineer, and his fiancée Inez Erickson, also 29, through, the detail is almost ceremonial by now, an open window. He shot Carnes 3 times in the head as he slept. Then he turned to Erickson, announced himself as the Night Stalker, the press name adopted as identity, the promotion he had wanted since the lipstick pentagrams, assaulted her and forced her through the ritual declaration the survivors of that summer all reported. Before leaving, he told her to tell the police that the Night Stalker had been there. He drove off in a stolen orange Toyota station wagon, taking the darkness with him, having committed what he did not know was the final attack of his life. Bill Carnes survived 3 bullets to the brain. with permanent damage that ended the life he had built, though not his life. Inez Eriksson, in the hours after the assault, did something the file marks as decisive. She gave investigators a full account, including the vehicle. And her account had a corroborating witness the killer had never registered. His name was James Romero III. He was 13 years old. Earlier that night, working on his motorbike in the family garage in Mission Viejo, he had noticed an orange Toyota station wagon cruising the street. Slowly, then again, the driver's window framing a face that looked at him a moment too long. The boy's instinct registered what patrol units across 2 cities had spent a summer hunting. Something wrong. He told his parents. They noted the car and a partial plate. When news of the attack on Carnes and Eriksson broke, the Romero family called it in. Now the task force had what it had never had in 6 months, and more than a dozen scenes. A specific vehicle, identified within hours, still presumably in Southern California. The stolen Toyota was found 2 days later, abandoned in a lot in the Rampart district of Los Angeles. The killer had wiped it. He was, by now, a student of his own coverage, and he knew what fingerprints meant. Forensic technicians processed the vehicle anyway, with a thoroughness that reflected what was riding on it, deploying among other techniques the then novel use of cyanoacrylate fuming, superglue vapor that fixes latent residue invisible to conventional dusting. And on a surface he had missed, one touch, one careless moment in a summer of discipline, they lifted a single usable print. What happened next is a hinge of criminal justice history, and the timing borders on the providential. A fingerprint in the analog era was only as good as the humans available to compare it against millions of inked cards. A search measured in months and usually futile. But in the summer of 1985, the state of California had just brought online its new automated fingerprint identification system, Cal-ID, a computerized database capable of doing in minutes what manual comparison could not do in years. The system was so new it had barely been used in anger. The print from the Toyota was among the first great tests of the machine. Technicians entered it, and the system returned a candidate, a set of prints taken years earlier, attached to an arrest record for driving offenses. Petty history, the kind of file that exists by the million. The name on the file was Richard Munoz Ramirez, born El Paso, Texas, 1960. 25 years old. Within hours, the task force had assembled his history, the burglary arrests, the drifter profile, the downtown geography that matched every behavioral inference they had drawn from the pawn shops and bus routes, and a booking photograph. Investigators laid the photo into arrays and put it before the survivors of the summer. The identifications came back, the thin face, the dark curls, the teeth. After 162 days of hunting a man defined by the absence of every identifier, the state of California knew exactly who the Night Stalker was. The decision that followed was argued at the highest levels of the task force, and the argument is worth recording because both sides were right. Withhold the name and photograph, and detectives could hunt him quietly. Surveillance, known associates, the downtown hotels, with the advantage of a target who did not know he was identified. Release it, and 8 million pairs of eyes joined the manhunt at the cost of telling him to run. The counter-argument to secrecy was the calendar. Every previous silence in the file had ended in a bedroom. Another night of discretion could be another Pan house, another Covenant house. The command decision came down on the side of the public. On August 30th, 1985, law enforcement released the name and face of Richard Ramirez at a press conference broadcast across California and the nation. Front pages carried the booking photo at full width. Television stations ran it at the top of every hour. The sheriff's message to the fugitive was, in substance, a sentence: "Every citizen of this state now knows your face." The file pauses here on a fact of almost unbearable irony. As the photograph saturated California, the man it depicted was not in California. He had done what he always did between kills, boarded a long-distance bus, this time to Arizona, reportedly to see a brother in Tucson. He spent the crucial hours of August 30th in transit, insulated from every broadcast, every front page, every pair of eyes being trained to recognize him. And in the early hours of August 31st, unaware that he had become the most famous face in America, Richard Ramirez stepped off a Greyhound bus into the downtown Los Angeles terminal. Walking with the confidence of a man still anonymous, into the one city on earth where his anonymity had been most completely destroyed. He noticed it in fragments, survivors of the morning recount. A glance held too long. A group of travelers clustered at a newsstand. Then the physical object itself, his own face, printed at poster scale, on the front page of every paper in the rack. He would later describe the moment in the flat register he used for everything. He was, in his words, a dead man walking. He left the terminal fast, heading east across the river toward Boyle Heights, into the dense working-class, overwhelmingly Mexican-American neighborhoods of East Los Angeles. It is possible, he calculated, that he could disappear there, among faces like his own, in streets like the ones that raised him. It was the last and greatest misjudgment of his life. Those neighborhoods had spent the summer sealing their windows in the heat like everyone else. Many of the dead and the survivors carried Latino and Asian immigrant surnames. The terror had never been anyone else's. The community he chose for camouflage was not a hiding place. It was a population that had been waiting all summer for exactly one face to walk down its street. And at 8:15 on that Saturday morning on Hubbard Street, it did. Saturday, August 31st, 1985. 8:15 in the morning. Hubbard Street, East Los Angeles. A block of small houses, chain-link fences, and families running weekend errands in the late summer heat. Richard Ramirez, moving fast and sweating through his black clothing, had one objective: a car. He crossed a yard, tried a door, kept moving. In front of one house, a woman named Angelina de la Torre sat in her vehicle with the keys in the ignition. Ramirez reached through and tried to pull her out. He never got the door fully open. Her husband, Manuel de la Torre, came off the property with a length of metal fence pipe in his hands and brought it down on the intruder's head. Ramirez broke and ran, and the street rose behind him. A neighbor, José Burguin, had heard the screaming and called his sons, Jaime and Julio, into the pursuit. Others joined from doorways and driveways as the shout traveled down the block ahead of the running man, and the shout was his own name, El Maton, the killer, the night stalker. He vaulted fences, cut through yards, tried another car and failed, and Manuel de la Torre caught him again, the pipe finding him a second time. By the time the crowd closed around him, Richard Ramirez was on the pavement, bleeding from the head, held down by the residents of a neighborhood that looked like the one he had grown up in. When the first patrol unit arrived, the deputy, in a coincidence the newspapers savored, was named Andrés Ramirez. he found the most hunted man in the United States, pinned beneath ordinary citizens on a residential street, saved from worse, in all probability, only by the arrival of the handcuffs. 14 months, at least 13 dead across two ends of the state. A task force of hundreds, a computerized fingerprint system, the largest manhunt in California's history. And the end of it was a man with a fence pipe defending his wife, and a street full of neighbors who refused to let the darkness leave the block. The people he had taught to fear the night caught him in broad daylight. Word reached the task force within minutes. Carrillo and Salerno drove to the scene of the arrest, and then to the station where the suspect sat chained, and the file records the strange flatness of the encounter. The two men who had reconstructed him from shoe prints and shell casings, for half a year now looking at a lanky 25-year-old with bad teeth and a head wound. There was no denial in him. In custody, Ramirez spoke of Satan as a protector, hummed rock lyrics, and displayed the pentagram on his palm to photographers at his arraignment, shouting, "Hail Satan!" as the cameras fired. The performance had begun. It would not stop for 8 years, because the trial of Richard Ramirez became, by broad consensus of the people who worked it, one of the most protracted and surreal proceedings in American judicial history. Jury selection alone consumed months. The pool of Angelenos without formed opinions about the Night Stalker was, functionally, a contradiction in terms. The evidence phase called well over 100 witnesses across a mountain of counts: 13 murders, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, 14 burglaries. The defense cycled through strategies and delays, and through all of it, the defendant treated the courtroom as a stage. The sunglasses, the black clothing, the pentagram flashed at photographers, the deadpan asides. Outside and inside the courtroom gathered a phenomenon that criminal psychologists study to this day: the groupies. Women, some of them dozens deep in correspondence, who wrote to him, attended sessions, declared love for a man whose crimes were being read into the record a few meters away. The forensic literature has vocabulary for it: hybristophilia, attraction to violent offenders. But the vocabulary explains less than the image. Rows of admirers at the trial of a man convicted of taking a hammer to women in their 80s. The proceedings absorbed shocks that would have collapsed lesser cases. In the middle of deliberations, juror Phyllis Singletree failed to appear, and the court learned she had been shot to death in her home. For a suspended, vertiginous moment, jurors confronted the possibility that the case had reached into the jury room itself. The truth was unconnected. She had been murdered by her boyfriend, who later took his own life. But the psychological damage was real. The alternate who replaced her joined a jury now personally acquainted with the subject matter. On September 20th, 1989, the verdicts came back, guilty across the board. Asked afterward for his reaction, Ramirez produced the line that closed the era the way the pentagrams had opened it. "Big deal. Death always went with the territory. See you in Disneyland." On November 7th, 1989, the court sentenced him to death, 19 times over. He was delivered to San Quentin's death row, and there the story enters its long, anticlimactic final act, the part the legend never includes. California's capital appeals process moves in decades. Ramirez settled into the routine of the condemned: cell, yard, correspondence. In 1996, he married one of his correspondents, a freelance magazine editor named Doreen Leoy, in a ceremony inside the prison. A marriage that eventually dissolved into estrangement, as even his most devoted mythology keepers drifted away. In 2009, the DNA match to 9-year-old Mei Lung in San Francisco added a final retroactive victim to the file. The murder that predated everything, confirmed a quarter-century late. He was never tried for it. There was no need. The state sentence already exceeded a human lifespan, and that, in the end, is how it concluded. Not in a gas chamber, but in a hospital bed. On June 7, 2013, Richard Ramirez died at Marin General Hospital of complications from B-cell lymphoma, his body further ruined by years of chronic substance abuse and hepatitis. He was 53. He had spent more than 23 years on death row, nearly as long as he had been alive when he was captured, and the state of California never executed him. The man who told a courtroom that death went with the territory was outlasted by the paperwork. Close the file, then, on the question this channel exists to ask: what does the case of Richard Ramirez actually reveal? Start with the investigative lesson, because it changed the profession. The doctrine of 1985 held that serial offenders were creatures of pattern, type, method, territory, and that pattern was the investigator's way in. Ramirez demonstrated that a killer could weaponize the doctrine itself, be patternless where the doctrine looked for patterns, and the doctrine would refuse to see him. Gil Carrillo's contribution to criminal investigation was not a technique. It was a willingness to believe the evidence over the training, to accept that the absence of pattern was the pattern before the profession had language for it. Every modern linkage system that weighs behavioral signature over surface method carries the fingerprints of that summer. Second, the technological hinge. The Night Stalker case sits at the exact seam between two eras of forensic science. The fingerprints from Jenny Winkau's window screen in 1984 were useless, not because they were poor, but because the machine to read them did not exist. The print from the Toyota in 1985 identified him in minutes, because it did. The same evidence, 1 year apart, separated by the arrival of a database. It is impossible to study the case without counting the victims who fall inside that gap. Third, and the file insists on this, the human anticlimax under the satanic theater. Strip the pentagrams, the courtroom performance, the nickname, and what remains is depressingly legible. A boy with 2 head injuries and epilepsy, marinated from age 12 in his cousin's atrocity photographs, witness at 13 to a murder that the justice system answered with 4 years in a hospital, apprentice to a voyeur, self-anesthetized on drugs from age 10. None of it excuses. Millions endure worse and harm no one, and the file has recorded his choices in full. But the mythology he built, the demonic servant, the chosen instrument, was always a promotion he awarded himself. The evidence describes something smaller. A man who learned early that consequences were negotiable and kept testing the proposition until a street in East Los Angeles corrected him, because that is the last thing the case reveals, and the reason it ends the way no other case of its scale ends. The Night Stalker was not stopped by profiling, though profiling found his name. He was not stopped by the largest task force in county history, though it built the net. He was stopped by Manuel de la Torre's fence pipe, by the Bourgoin family running toward the screaming, by a 13-year-old who wrote down a license plate, by a neighborhood that had memorized a face, a killer whose entire method was the certainty that people inside their homes were passive, sleeping, separate, unaware, was finished the moment the city stopped being passive. He made everyone a potential victim. In doing so, he made everyone a hunter. The terror he engineered was, in the end, the exact mechanism of his capture. And no analysis of the mind of Richard Ramirez is complete without noting that he never saw it coming. He lived among them. He always did. Until the morning they recognized him. If this case held you, the archive is open. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Some killers hide behind a pattern. The next one hid behind a badge of ordinariness, so complete that even the people closest to him never asked the right question.